They think we shouldn't have democracy. I mean, I'm sure that's Osama bin Laden's fondest dream. If he could turn it into a war against Muslims, he'd have won. Terrorism that they carry out against us, but not the much worse terrorism that we carry out against them. When I grew up as a kid, most of my family was working class, Jewish working class in New York. A lot of them never went to school, but they were very educated. There were workers' education programs. There were all sorts of other groupings. A lot of them were around the left parties, Communist Party, whatever you think about it, did run worker education programs and summer camps for unemployed seamstresses and things like this. And people ended up as educated as anyone I ever met at Harvard, even though some of them never went past fourth grade. And a lot of activists at that time were involved in worker education. In fact, a lot of well-known scientists were. Those were the years when people were writing books like, I don't know if you've ever seen The Mathematics for the Millions, which was a book written by a good mathematician for people who never had any education. And they learned from it. And it was, part of being on the left at that time was bringing what we call high culture, science, mathematics, the arts, and so on, to people who didn't have the advantages of the privileges of going through school. Going through school then meant even maybe getting to fourth grade. And it could certainly be done. It ends up, people want it, they like it, they participate in it, they go on by themselves. And those of us, all of us who are privileged, one of the responsibilities is to help people do this for themselves. The jingoist fanaticism in the First World War is hard to describe. I mean, in the United States, which was kind of like barely involved, the Boston Symphony Orchestra couldn't play Beethoven. It was just fanatic hysteria and incredible repression. Again, not like a dictatorship, military dictatorship, but what actually happened was unbelievable. It continued after the war. It was largely due to the liberals. This is not Joe McCarthy. This is Woodrow Wilson, liberal intellectuals, the New Republic Circle, John Dewey Circle, and so on. Dewey later was sorry about it, but not most of them. Take, say, Eugene Debs. He was the leading figure in the American labor movement. Presidential candidate, did quite well, Socialist Party. He made a speech in, I guess it was 1918, in which he talked to working people about what wars are like, and he was right. He said wars are not fought in the interests of poor and working people. They're fought in the interests of the rich and powerful. Sometimes maybe you want to be part of it, sometimes not, but you have a legal right to pay attention, to pursue, within a certain range, a course of action. You should think about it. Woodrow Wilson tossed him in jail. He stayed there. In 1920, I think it was, there was a post-war amnesty, and Wilson amnestied virtually everybody, but not Debs, who he had particular hatred for. In fact, Debs was finally amnestied by Warren Harding, the ultra-right-wing Republican who came later. Well, that's one example, and by far from the most extreme. What the reaction was in England, I really haven't studied, so I don't know, but I suspect it was about the same to Russell. And then he went on under a cloud. Never got back an academic appointment. When he came to the United States, must have been 1939 or so, for lectures at City University. He was basically banned, not for anti-war activities, but for his attitudes towards marriage and education and so on. There were people who supported him, like Dewey, for example, much to his credit, and others, but it was hard. Then in the 1950s, when he became involved in the anti-nuclear protests, then it became, people who just signed petitions were respected, but not people who did something about it. that was going too far. And when it came to actually the leading figure in the CND, the organization, the anti-nuclear work, and then also the leading figure in the international anti-Vietnam peace movement, is one of those heroes who's unknown because, first of all, because she was a woman, and secondly, because she did too much. That's Peggy Duff, who was a close friend and became an activist in the late 40s when she was protesting Britain's illegal holding of German war prisoners after the war, using them for labor in all sorts of ways. And she was one of the early protesters against that, then became a leading figure in the CND. And during the Vietnam War, I mean, she was the person who organized, the international peace movement. Should have gotten the Nobel Peace Prize about 20 times, but that's not the kind of person who gets it. Russell joined in. He's one of the very few activists who did. Actually, it was the same here. We organized, I started becoming involved in anti-war resistance, not protest, in 1965. And by 1966 or 7, there was the beginnings of an organized resistance movement. The group here, which was called Resist, was formed in 1967 to try to support direct resistance to the war. I was one of the founders, and I was, of the group of us who did it, I was the one who was asked to approach prominent people around the world to see if they'd sign our pledge of resistance. And the first person I wrote to was Russell, and immediately got back an answer saying, yes, be glad to sign. The second one was another philosopher, Rudolf Carnap, and he said, sure, immediately signed, and a few others. But if you look at the list, it's not much. And Russell didn't only sign, he acted. Not in this case, we're here, he's there, but yes, he acted, helping to organize the tribunal and many other ways. And in the West, the more active you are in opposing your own crimes, the more vilification, slander, and lies you receive. That's almost, it's so close to predictable, it's almost a historical law. And it's not just true in the United States, very true. That's a good deal of intellectual history is just like that. There are exceptions, like the Turkish intellectuals I mentioned, who Europe could have a lot to learn from, but it's not ordinary. Peggy Duff was a real exception. People talk about the Vietnam War, but that's more historical amnesia. John F. Kennedy publicly announced the fact that the U.S. Air Force was bombing South Vietnam 40 years ago, in 1962. That's also when chemical warfare was started to destroy food crops, to prevent people who were supporting the indigenous resistance. And programs were initiated to drive millions of people into what amounted to concentration camps, to separate them from the resistance forces that the government knew they were willingly supporting. I mean, there were no Chinese, no Russians, actually no North Vietnamese, if for some reason they're not allowed to be in their own country. This was just an attack against South Vietnamese. But there was no protest. It went on for years. In fact, for 4 or 5 years, there was barely a whisper of protest while the country was just about devastated. There were people who protested, like, say, Bertrand Russell, but he was bitterly condemned for protesting when B-52s were carrying out saturation bombing of the densely populated Mekong Delta in the south. Sidney Hook, for example, bitterly condemned Russell for saying that there's anything wrong with this. According to Hook, it was maybe people died, but they were the unintended consequences of military action, quoting him, at a time when you're carrying out saturation bombing of densely populated peasant areas. And that was considered perfectly okay. In fact, there was just a big meeting in New York celebrating Sidney Hook and his wonderful achievements, and you can't find apologetics for massacre like this unless you go really deep into the Stalinist archives. But that was considered normal, and still considered normal by intellectuals. But the population changed. By 1969, about 70% of the population
regarded the war as, I'm quoting from the polls, fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. That's by 1969, and those figures have stayed pretty steady until today. But with virtually no support from articulate opinion, you can do an investigation and see how often you've found that expressed. But it is the mood of the population, and it's led to much greater resistance to aggression and violence than was the case in the 1960s. And we can talk about issue after issue. I mean, the country's just become a lot more civilized, and so has a good deal of the West. And it wasn't given as a gift. I mean, any more than civil rights were or anything else, or labor rights or anything you can think of. These are the results of constant struggle. And the options are perfectly well open to us, much more open to us than to most people in the world. I mean, we've got an enormous amount of freedom thanks to the achievements of our predecessors who struggled to win that freedom. And now we have it, and that gives us opportunities that most people in the world just don't have. You know, like you try to speak up for freedom of speech in Turkey, as many people courageously do, you can end up in a Turkish prison, which isn't a lot of fun. You try to do it in one of the U.S. client states in Latin America, you can get your brains blown out. In Colombia, for example. We don't have those problems. So for us to talk, there's no problem in carrying out activities, and we've got plenty of opportunities. It's succeeded in the past. There's no reason why it shouldn't continue to. So I don't see any problem there. In fact, I think it's the best period for organizing and activism that I can remember, at least in my lifetime.
There were forms of resistance that I strongly disapproved of, and I don't think they were resistance. I think they were a gift to power, like the Weathermen, for example. By the late 60s, early 70s, a lot of young kids were pretty upset for good reasons, and some of them sort of went off the deep end. And I and others tried to cut that back, sometimes succeeded, sometimes failed. Some good friends ended up in long jail sentences. But there was a very effective nonviolent resistance. 1965, I and an artist friend in Boston started organizing national tax resistance. It never became a huge movement, but it was substantial. Refusal to pay taxes as long as the war went on. By 66 or 67, resistance against participation in the war was beginning. It's called draft resistance, but it really meant refusal to participate in the war. And that was young people. And they were very courageous. They were vilified too, of course, because they were just too courageous and too honorable and rejecting shibboleths. And they suffered for it. A lot of them left the country. It's not easy for a 17-year-old kid or 18-year-old kid to say, okay, I'm going to leave my country and never come back. Many of them went to jail. A lot of them were kind of broken psychologically. Some of them came out quite strong. And there were a support group. I mean, I also was technically a draft resistor. I was overage. If I sent back my draft card, they weren't going to do anything about it. But there were adult support groups, and it went beyond that. There was support for deserters, other things, and some things we can't really talk about. But and in fact, there are potential penalties. I mean, I actually, personally, I was on the verge of a long prison sentence. But trials were called off by the government after the Tet Offensive, although I'd already been designated as coming up in the next trial. And we anticipated that. I mean, it's, again, it's not like a third world country. You're not going to get your head blown off. It's not pleasant. It's nothing like that. And it's not like being in a Turkish prison. Those people are really brave. But those things were always looming. Some trials did take place. And people like the Farragans, for example, were tried for the crime of, as Dan Berrigan eloquently said, I apologize, dear friends, for putting blood on in a draft center instead of pouring it out on the streets where the victims are. Yes, that's considered deplorable if it's our crimes. If it's somebody else's crimes, it's considered noble. And resistance took many forms, from people like Dave Dellinger, who was also not young and had been a Second World War resistor, was a leading figure throughout till the end of his life. In fact, he died very recently. And these are very honorable people. And it went everywhere from signing petitions to demonstrations to actual resistance to support for resistance and so on. And then there was a fringe that decided, well, we're going to have a revolution. So Yashka Fisher, beating up a policeman and so on and so forth. It's that fringe that's famous. That's why the 60s are called the time of troubles, horrible period. Yeah, there was a fringe that you can pick up, that you can make fun of or vilify and so on, but not the main part of it. The main part of it is hated for a different reason, namely it was a democratizing force. It changed, it brought civilized values into the society, and not just with regard to aggression. I mean, take, say, women's rights. Where did the movement for women's rights come from? Of course, it has origins. It really took off not actually in the 60s, but in the 70s. And it was largely a result of the activism of the 60s, which made people think about a lot of things. Same with the environmental movement. In fact, the country is just a lot more civilized than it was. And that's why the 60s are so hated and so despised by the intellectual world. Very much like Russell. It's the normal reaction. In the 2000 election, right before the election, so before any Florida or any of that stuff, about 75% of the population regarded it as a farce. They had nothing to do with them. They didn't want to take it seriously. In fact, there was just when the usual 50% voted. If you break it down by class, the more wealthy, educated sectors voted in their class interests. So they voted for the more reactionary, the two business parties that are running. If you look at them, but they're not enough to swing the election. They're a small part. The way the election was swung was by mostly white working class. And if you look at the issues that they voted on, there were two main issues. One is what's called religiosity. Like, is the guy who's standing there enough of a fundamentalist Christian extremist? And the other was gun control, guns. So those were the two issues on which people voted. Now, those are not their top issues by any means. The issues they're concerned about, same polls show, are mostly economic issues. But they didn't come up in the election. You can't bring them into an election because elite opinion and popular opinion are opposite poles. So they can't come up and they can't be discussed in the media and so on, and people know it. That's why they're regarded as a farce. Actually, there was just an international poll taken a couple of days ago run by the World Economic Forum, in which they asked people all sorts of questions. But the most interesting one was, do you think that the government reflects the will of the people? Well, most of the world, no. But the interesting part was North America, the United States and Canada. It was a minority. A minority, despite all the propaganda and everything else, still only a minority of the population in the U.S. and Canada thinks that the government reflects the will of the people. And that's an exaggeration, because when people answer that question, their first thing that's coming to their mind is, what did my 8th grade civics teacher tell me? And you're supposed to say yes. And if they say no, it's because they're thinking about it. The actual figures are going to be much lower, because people understand. We don't have capitalism. There's nothing remotely like it. We have various varieties of state capitalism, including the USSR. That was one variety of state capitalism, was based on wage labor, on management control, central coordination of production. In fact, it's in many ways very much like corporate capitalism. Just this different kind of organization. So of the various kinds of state capitalism that are around, which are the best? I don't honestly think that's the kind of question we should be asking. Like suppose you're in the 18th century, should you be asking which is the best kind of feudalism? I mean, that's all there was, So which is the best kind of feudalism and slavery and monarchy and so on and so forth? It just wasn't the right question.
I mean, the right question is there something better, like, say, parliamentary democracy, even though there were no examples of it? And there were seeds of it, but there were no functioning examples. I mean, seeds of it had been developed and usually crushed, as in England, but these were legitimate struggles. And, they succeeded. I mean, by now you have parliamentary democracies, which aren't fantastic, but are better than feudalism. And can you have, say, worker self-management in industry? I mean, I don't know of any law that says you can, law of nature that says you can't, or law of history. And I think that'd be a lot better than management control. Can you have something better than the state capitalist institutions that we have? Yeah, we can design lots of others. In fact, we can go back to the workers in the mills in Lawrence, Mass., who took for granted that those who work in the mills should own them and should run them democratically. Is that so outlandish? And you can say the same about communities and so on. So why just take for granted that the forms of authority and you could say the same about sexism and racism. I mean, every society that I can think of has significant forms of sexism and racism, but we don't therefore ask, well, which is the best one of those? None of them are the best ones. We want to get rid of those tendencies. So I just question whether that's the right way to think about it.
It's not so much what's the best, it's what is the alternative.
I think when we say, that's back to like sketching utopia again. I mean, that's certainly beyond my capacity. I can't imagine. I'm not smart enough to imagine what a utopia is for all the different kinds of human beings in the world with their different interests and concerns and what they like and what they hate and so on and so forth. I mean, they should have all kinds of possibilities, and I don't know what they are. So I don't think we can ask the general question, what's the best system? I mean, there are people who think they can ask that. I can't. We should say, well, what do we do about this problem? Like, take the problem of management and ownership control in a tyrannical system, like a business. Business is a tyranny. Okay, it's like a Soviet Union. It's got control from the top. If you're in the middle, you take orders from above and you hand them down below. At the very bottom, you're allowed to rent yourself to it. Now, it's not obvious why things have to work like that. It could be democratically controlled by the participants. No owners, no managers, just those who participate. And in fact, there could be a broader participation. So it's somewhere. It's in a community. And the community should have some say in it. So you have community participation and participation on the part of the workforce. That's perfectly feasible. In fact, there are plenty of ideas that have been around like that for a long time, and some of them have been worked out. So is the question that we have to ask ourselves is, well, is that an alternative? Is a possible alternative? Sure it is. Is it the kind of possible alternative we want to work for? If it is, it would dismantle capitalism. But we have to decide, is that what we want, or is that what other people want? I mean, is that what the workers in the plant want? My guess is that most people are ready for it this minute, and that if the opportunity arises, they'd leap at it. I mean, I don't think they need us to encourage them. It's just that the options aren't there. For an individual, for people in a plant to do it means taking a very serious risk. So the first risk will be that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police or whatever the counterpart is will come in and beat the shit out of them. That's a risk. And unless they have community support, they're not going to get away with it. So it's a struggle. That's a class struggle. But if you ask, if you talk to workers in a plant, I don't think many of them would find this very hard to understand, that they ought to run it themselves. I mean, they can understand it as much as the, factory girls in Lowell in 1860. I think that's just below the surface in all groups that I've ever had anything to do with. I think democracy is a great thing. Here I oppose the mainstream of opinion, which is opposed to democracy. They think we shouldn't have democracy. That's what I was indicating in that little historical excursus from Madison to the present, right through the progressive opinion. They don't want democracy. They want polyarchy. That is a system of, again, elite decision and public ratification, and then the spectators, namely the great beast, go back and do something else. I'm not in favor of that. I think democracy would be much better. Here I agree with the great majority of the American population, and in fact the great majority of the population of the world, who do not believe that their governments represent them. Actually, if you want to know some data on this, the World Economic Forum a couple of days ago released an international poll, Gallup organization and others, in which they asked people around the world a whole lot of questions, one of which was, do you think your government represents you? Okay. In North America, it was about 40%. The majority said the government doesn't represent us in North America. And the actual number is far lower, we know from more detailed polls, because when people are asked that question, do you think your government represents you, they tend to give the answer that they learned in an 8th grade civics class. So that comes out reflexively. On the other hand, if you push the questions further, you find that it's much worse. So about 80% of the US population, when asked further questions, says the government I'm quoting, the government works for the few and the special interests, not the people. It's around 80%. It was about a steady 50% until the Reagan years, when it went up to 80% and stayed pretty steady. That's the more democratic countries. The same is happening in Latin America. So in Latin America, there's a lot of talk about the great victory of democracy. And in fact, people want democracy. But if you look at the poll results, which are taken regularly, faith in the existing democratic system has been declining steadily because people know it isn't working. And the reasons for that are pretty clear. The so-called wave of democracy came along with neoliberalism, which undermines democracy. Can't have them both. In fact, it's almost designed for that purpose. So as the neoliberal programs are extended, the recognition that democracy isn't working for us increases, and it's now even gotten to the point where roughly half the population in Latin America says they'd even accept military dictatorships. If you know anything about the history of Latin America, you know what that means. That's pretty brutal. Not that they don't want democracy. They do want democracy. So the answer to the question, the statement about democracy being not perfect, but the best thing we have, that's Winston Churchill. But the trouble is that Winston Churchill, like others, didn't like democracy. So what we ought to do is develop democracy, that is popular participation in decision-making all across the board, you know, economic and workshops and factories and schools, every institution, and certainly in the political system. But that's precisely what people have been fighting for hundreds of years, and elite and power centers have been trying to block. So continue fighting for it. I don't see the problem. We should try to achieve democracy. It's a good thing to achieve, but you got to struggle against concentrated power for that.
The vilification industry, which is directed almost reflexively against any person who can't be disregarded, who's challenging power and authority, that comes automatically. And in fact, comes particularly in free societies. In a violent society, like, say, U.S. colonies in El Salvador, you don't have to vilify intellectuals, you just blow their brains out. Okay, so not a big problem. But in free societies, where the state does not have very much power to coerce, it's necessary to turn to other measures to assure doctrinal rigidity. And it's a very rigid intellectual culture. It's remarkably so when you look. I mean, just to give one example, which Russell was very much involved in, the Vietnam War protest. In the United States, by 1969, about 70% of the population agreed with Russell, described the war. You take a look at the polls, they described the war as fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. Okay, try to find that in the published literature somewhere. I mean, U.S. attacked South Vietnam in 1962. We've got over 40 years of literature. Find somebody in print who said the war was fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. About the most critical position you can get is it was a mistake. We started with benevolent intentions, like always, but we miscalculated this, we didn't understand that, and ended up being a mistake, which cost us too much. It's not 100%, but it's so close to uniform. You can virtually describe it as 100%, not the population and not Russell. And we're seeing the same thing now. There's a huge debate now about Iraq, right? Just check and see in the liberal media, National Public Radio, so on, counterparts in England and Canada. Ask how many times the coverage differs from cheering for the home team in a high school football game. Like, how's our side doing? Maybe, we shouldn't have done that play because it was a mistake. In fact, much of the coverage now from the liberal end, is not very different from the Russian press in the 1980s over Afghanistan. We shouldn't have gotten in, it's a mistake to me. Russian soldiers dying and so on. Is it wrong to invade another country? And is it wrong to carry out the supreme crime of Nuremberg, for which we hanged people with a very noble declarations that this judgment means nothing unless we apply the same standards to ourselves? Try to find an example. You have to search pretty hard. Anyone who does say it or try to say it, either they can be ignored, like most are, or if they can't be ignored, the vilification industry goes into operation. Lies, hysteria, slanders, and so on. Right in the middle of the intellectual mainstream. That happens to be a core part of the intellectual and moral elite culture. And it's a pretty natural development in societies that are free. You don't need so much of it if you've got coercion. So you take, say, Franco Spain, fascist dictatorship. There was actually a fair amount of open discussion. You could have a Marxist bookstore and so on. As long as you had the torture chamber in the center of Madrid and you could walk past and hear people screaming, let them talk. There are many cases of that. And take, say, the civil rights movement in the United States. You talk about the civil rights movement, you think of Martin Luther King. Correct, very important figure, had a tremendous impact. Notice his impact, however. His impact was great when he was denouncing brutal sheriffs in Alabama. By the mid-'60s, he was taking a broader position. He was trying to organize a poor people's movement. In fact, he was assassinated just at the time of big demonstrations and actions, which were going to be a poor people's movement. He came out rather mildly, but he came out against the Vietnam War. At that point, his reputation begins to sink. That's not the Russell, the King you're supposed to remember. That's not the one you talk about on Martin Luther King Day. As long as you're vilifying Alabama sheriffs, that's a little bit like vilifying Soviet commissars. Yeah, that's okay. Get along with that. When you get closer to home, it begins to change. If he had proceeded, he would have been subject to the vilification industry. He was killed. His role was important, very important in the civil rights movement. But as I'm sure he would have been the first to say, he was not leading it. He was following it. The leadership of the civil rights movement was young black students and others, freedom riders, sitting in at lunch counters, riding the freedom buses, trying to open schools, a lot of them beaten, some killed, many of them destroyed. Most of the names are almost unknown except to people active in the movements. They were the leaders. They're the ones who set the conditions under which Martin Luther King could do the very important things he did, like come to a demonstration and give an inspirational speech and inspire others to go on and make an impact and so on. And that was very important. And in fact, as long as he was focusing on people were allowed to hate, like Alabama sheriffs on the Ku Klux Klan. You know, as long as he could do that, it's okay. As soon as he moved closer to home, he moved into that area where if he hadn't been assassinated, he would have been vilified. I mean, the period when the press was most free was about the mid-19th century. I mean, at that time, just keeping to say England and the United States, the two cases that have been studied, I imagine it's the same elsewhere. In the mid-19th century, there was a very lively, popular press, very widely read by working people, by everyone. That much reached far beyond the commercial media at the time. It was very diverse. It represented, it reflected public interests and public concerns, and was very popular. In Britain, they tried to close it down by censorship of various kinds, but that didn't work. There were too many ways to avoid it. And it was finally understood that the way to eliminate it was by advertising, by reliance on advertising and by concentration of capital. So just through the effect of reliance on advertising, which was then just a kind of beginning, like around a century ago, and concentration of capital, they realized that over time they could marginalize the independent popular press, which couldn't get the advertising, of course, because advertisers don't like what they were saying, and didn't have the capital. And it took a long time. So in England, it was actually up until about 40 years ago, still the case 40 years ago, that the main newspaper in England, the Daily Herald, was a kind of labor-oriented, social democratic newspaper, very popular. Everybody had outsold all the others. The Mirror, which was the main tabloid, was the same, kind of leftist paper, popular paper. But they kind of succumbed to advertising pressure and capital control. The United States happened a bit earlier, but it was the same process. And advertising is, it's part of a much bigger industry. Advertising is part of the public relations industry, which is a huge industry. And it developed very consciously around the First World War in the two most democratic countries, England and the United States. And there's a good reason for it. They were coming to as the countries were becoming more free, that just through popular struggle, and people were winning the franchise, and you couldn't shut them up anymore by force, it was understood that you're going to have to control people by controlling opinion and attitudes, because we can't rely on force anymore. And control of opinion and attitudes means, there was actually a phrase for it. This was the time when what was called scientific management of work was becoming a big issue, Taylorite management, Ford and all that stuff. But it was also understood you want to not only control very closely the lives of people in their work time, but also you have to control them in their off-work time. And what you have to do is turn them into passive, obedient consumers who don't pay, don't try to get out of our hair, basically. Pay attention to what were called the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption. You get them trapped into consumerism, isolated from one another, atomized, control their beliefs. That's where notions like manufacture of consent come from right after this First World War. And out of this came huge industries. And advertising is a large part of it, but and it, of course, affects the media enormously. I mean, if any of you are, if you watch television, for example, take, say, television. When you turn on the television set, the corporation doesn't make any money, right? Like you don't pay them when you turn it on, unless it's cable. But they do. So why do they do it? Well, they do it because of the advertising. So the resources and the creativity and the effort and so on in the whole television industry goes into advertising. In fact, within the television industry, there are words called content and fill. Like a program has content and a program has fill. The content is the advertising. The fill is the car chase that's in there to keep you watching until the next ad comes along. And all the effort, of course, goes into the advertising. And the fill has two
first of all, it's keep your interest enough so you watch the advertising, but the advertising is there for a purpose. I mean, it's to turn people into creatures whose only concern in life is to max out their 5 credit cards and not to pay attention to what's going on in the world and let the rich, powerful guys do what they want without interference. And for the more educated sectors, folks like us, it's to make sure that they have the right beliefs. So that's the elite media, instill the right beliefs. Actually, that's what universities are for too. Schools, universities, media. That's not so much advertising control in that case as just the general indoctrination. But the scale of this is incredible. I mean, there's what's called marketing, which is just manipulation and control, and is concerned very specifically with off-job control of people's lives, much like the on-job control in scientific management. It's estimated to be about 1/6 of gross domestic product in the United States, which is maybe $1 or $2 trillion a year. I mean, it doesn't contribute to economic efficiency or anything. It contributes to control and domination. That's why, when I watch television with my 2-year-old grandchildren, they're already being inundated by a flood of stuff to buy this and buy that and get your mother to buy you this and so on and so forth. And that's got to be what life's about. It invaded Cuba in 1961, and the invasion was beaten back. There was then a build-up to what looked very much like a coming invasion. As McNamara said, I quoted him, if he was in the shoes of the Russians and the Cubans, that's what he would have assumed from the extension of the Kennedy terrorist operations. Then came the Cuban Missile Crisis, which almost brought everything to an end, right? I mean, we've just learned how bad it was, but even before that, it was understood that this was an extremely dangerous moment. After that, the U.S. Backed off of invasion plans and kept to just international terrorism. That's the primary success of deterrence in the whole post-war period. It's never discussed in the literature on deterrence because it's deterrence of the United States, and therefore you're not allowed to talk about it. But in fact, if you think about the successes of so-called deterrence, that's it. It's way above any other. The U.S. government was deterred from an invasion of Cuba. After 1990, when there was no longer any military deterrence, it's kind of recognized that an invasion isn't worth it. I mean, you can use international economic arrangements and neoliberal policies and other mechanisms are around that make it possible to strangle a country without invasion. I mean, that's why Kennedy initiated a military coup in Brazil, and it took place because the Brazilian government was becoming too independent, too oriented toward domestic needs and so on. They're not calling for I'm almost certain the U.S. isn't trying to institute a military coup now in Brazil, when the government, it's after the most free election in the history of the hemisphere or maybe the world, which is going off in social democratic directions that the U.S. and other major powers don't like. But I'll bet you they're not thinking of a military coup because they have much more efficient techniques now for strangling democracy, like financial liberalization. Financial liberalization 30 years ago, well understood. I mean, it's understood by Keynes and Harry Dexter White. That's the way the post-war system was set up. If you have financial liberalization, you have a tremendous weapon against democracy. The social democratic measures of the 50s and the 60s in much of the world were possible because governments had some space. They had space because the Bretton Woods system that was established after the First World War purposely put limits on capital movement. Governments were allowed to control capital and currencies were more or less fixed. It didn't work perfectly, but that was the principle. And that gave governments some space to carry out what we call welfare state measures. Once you have free capital flow, that's finished. If a country goes, in fact, you read the technical economic literature, they explain that if you have free capital flow, which incidentally, speculative capital just rose astronomically after these constraints were broken in the early 70s. And when you have this huge flood of speculative capital and free flight of capital, governments can't constrain it, that creates what's called a virtual Senate of investors and lenders who carry out a moment-by-moment referendum on government policies, and if they don't like them, they just destroy the country by attacking the currency and by capital flight and other means. And that works, you know. So the way to prevent, and you could see it, as soon as it became clear that in Brazil Lula was going to win the election, the IMF and the Treasury Department and international investors and lenders and so on, you know, without any collaboration, I mean, it's too obvious to have collaboration, immediately started attacking the currency. So it fell way down. They had to raise interest rates to hopeless levels. Development stops. Capital flight pours out of the country. Capital pours out of the country. In fact, the famous Latin American debt is not that much beyond the flight of capital over the last 20 or 30 years, which suggests an easy way to overcome it, incidentally. But those mechanisms and other neoliberal mechanisms like privatization and so on, they simply reduce the possibility for the functioning of a democratic system. So you don't need military coups. You don't need invasion. I think that's why the economic warfare against Cuba intensified after the Russians disappeared. I mean, the pretext for it was, you know, tentacle of the Russian Empire about to strangle us. As soon as that disappeared, the warfare intensified under pressure from Democrats, incidentally. The first measure, the Torricelli measures in liberal Democrats in 1992, Bush #1 was going to veto them, but he was outflanked from the right by Clinton and was forced to ratify it, and then it got worse a couple of years later. By now, it's been denounced by every international agency that has anything to do with international law. I mean, even the OAS, which is very compliant, their legal commission condemned the measures as in violation of international law, as has everyone else. The European Union tried to bring that to the World Trade Organization as a violation of World Trade Organization rules. The Clinton administration basically just told them to get lost. They said, we're going to call this a national security exemption, and if you don't like it, get lost. That's Clinton, not Bush. And therefore, those measures can continue to strangle the economy. You don't have to invade. That's the way it looks to me. But remember, when they had a chance, they did invade, and it almost led to a nuclear war, and then they backed off and resorted only to international terrorism.
One part of the neoliberal program, crucial part from 30 years ago, has been to try to make sure that democracy can't function by creating that's the point of free flow of capital, well understood. If you have free flow of capital, there's going to be what's called a virtual parliament of investors and lenders that will actually control policies of a country by simply attacking the currency, pulling out capital, and so on if it veers in the wrong direction. So it has a negative effect on economic growth, and even profit, but nobody cares about that because it's something more important. It undermines democracy. And you can see it happening right at this moment in Brazil. I mean, the international financial investor community is deeply concerned that democracy not function in Brazil, and they started the usual means. Well, you know, Brazil alone probably can't do anything about it, but in solidarity with activists in the north, it could. And this has sometimes worked. So just to give you one example that worked, a pretty dramatic one, and you may know about it, so stop me if you do, but about 2 years ago or so, there was one of these main demonstrations in Washington. It happened to coincide with something going on in Bolivia. The under World Bank orders, more or less, Bolivia was privatizing water, and big Western corporations like Bechtel and others were going to take over Bolivian water and charge user fees. Well, you know what that means. Okay, charge user fees for water. 90% of the population
can't drink water. But that's considered efficient or something, and in some sense it is. There were protests in Bolivia, so peasants were protesting. They declared martial law. People were getting shot and so on. But as long as this is going on in Cochabamba and Bolivia, nobody's going to pay the slightest attention to it, no matter how many people get killed. But some of the activists there in Bolivia had the bright idea of using the internet to organize international protest. And it became one of the big issues in the Washington protests. All right, that you have to pay attention to. And people were, picketing Bechtel offices in New Zealand and, things like this. Anyhow, the corporations backed off, and the World Bank backed off. They'll undoubtedly come back some other way, but it's the kind of thing that can be done with international solidarity and large-scale activism. And there are plenty of examples like it. And in fact, I don't think there's ever been a time when there were so many opportunities for popular organizing and for grassroots movements on every imaginable issue. It's an unusually favorable moment for that.
Well, for a Western privileged intellectual, he's quite unusual. So he refused, he objected to the First World War, objected to the atmosphere of jingoist hysteria and fanaticism, and he was dismissed from his university position, spent time in prison. Later, he stood up for his views, and we know what happened. He denied employment, so on. In his, when he was already fairly old, he was on the streets protesting against the likely destruction of the world, nuclear war. Einstein and Russell published that dramatic statement just 50 years ago, calling on the people of the world to face the fact that they had a stark choice, either end war or end the human species. And Russell, in fact, did something about it. He was part of the protests, civil disobedience. He was bitterly condemned. He vilified, lied about. It got worse when he was one of the early opponents of the Vietnam War. That was considered totally illegitimate. The way he was treated in the United States was just shocking. This book that reviews the New York Times record and others. But he kept at it, and that's very admirable. Now, in the West, that's almost unknown. However, in other parts of the world, it's not unknown. So take, say, Turkey. The European Union is trying to decide whether Turkey lives up to its elevated standards. And when I'm in Europe and hear about this, I sometimes have to laugh. European intellectuals have a lot to learn from Turkish intellectuals. They are like Russell. In Turkey, leading writers, publishers, artists, academics, journalists are not only constantly protesting draconian laws and brutal repression, but they're doing something about it all the time. They are carrying out civil disobedience. They're presenting books of banned authors to the state prosecutor and demanding to be prosecuted. I actually joined them once for that. There's a publisher now on trial for publishing a book by an MIT professor, in fact, which happens to include critical material on Turkey. That same publisher was on trial 3 years ago. I was there in Istanbul as a co-defendant. In fact, it was publishing a book of mine which had some quotes about it. And he's being supported. In the West, you find it very hard to find a duplicate of that. Russell was one of the very rare ones. You will find people who sign petitions. And in fact, if there's enormous protest against the crimes of others, so everybody would flock to Czechoslovakia to denounce the crimes of the communists. But try to find a counterpart here. In fact, I don't know if your camera can pick it up, but right behind me there's a picture of the reality of the world. Those are some real heroes. One of them is the murdered archbishop in El Salvador, Archbishop Romero, conservative archbishop, became upset about the atrocities and crimes being carried out by U.S.-backed state terrorists, pleaded with President Carter not to send military aid to the junta. A week later was assassinated by basically U.S.-backed death squads while they were saying Mass. So that's one figure. The other figures are six leading Jesuit intellectuals, had their brains blown out by U.S. armed and trained elite battalion, which had already killed thousands of people. Now, that kind of frames the decade of the 80s, what's called here the War on Terror. Actually a major terrorist war, which could go on because Western intellectuals were backing it, didn't expose it. That, if anything like that had happened in Czechoslovakia, the cries of anguish and hysteria would be, blowing off the roof. But since we did it, it's unknown. So I've noted, it was given to me by a Jesuit priest about 10 years ago, and I just put it there because I want to remember what the world is. But I've noticed since that time, endless numbers of people come through here. People from south of the Rio Grande know what it is. People from north of the Rio Grande, namely the ones with the blood on their hands, rarely know unless they happen to be activists. If you took a poll at the Harvard Faculty Club, maybe 5% in the Latin American department might know what it is. Probably nobody else. From Europe, it's maybe 10%. Again, if it had happened, let's say, in Czechoslovakia, we probably might have even had a nuclear war, but certainly the protests would be outlandish. In Turkey, they're like that. In fact, in much of the third world, you find courageous people really doing the kinds of things that have to be done, and well-known, prominent writers, intellectuals, others. Extremely rare in the countries that have wealth and privilege and plenty of opportunity, but overwhelmingly prefer to take high-minded positions about the crimes of others and either deny or support their own crimes.
Andean region in general is considered a major problem, and the U.S. is basically at war in Colombia, and has forces going into it has air bases and other bases being built around the region in Ecuador and Peru and so on, with soldiers there, and they're expecting problems. But it's at war in Colombia. Colombia is subjected to extensive chemical warfare right now. I was there a couple months ago in southern Colombia, in one of the worst areas, just talking to peasants who are being driven off the land by chemical warfare, and it's very serious. It's called fumigation, but it's in fact chemical warfare, which is driving peasants off the land, destroying the land, opening up the air. Once peasants are driven off, and there are millions of them, probably 40% of the displaced people in the world roughly are in Colombia, and it's increasing. There's 300,000 more every year. Once they're driven off the land, multinational corporations can come in. They can start strip mining. They can extract oil, do anything they feel like. Fumigation, chemical warfare, destroys biodiversity and destroys peasant agriculture. Peasant agriculture is very efficient, but it's very fragile. These are systems that are developed over millennia, in fact, and they're highly attuned to the specific complex biodiversity. You plant this seed on this side of a rock and that kind of thing. It just takes one generation to kill it. You kill a tradition, it's finished. You can't reconstruct that tradition. The biodiversity, which is extremely rich in southern Colombia, it's like Brazil, is being wiped out. The long-term effect, and they know it, will be to, as I said, open the place up. It has a lot of resources, but you got to drive the people off first, and they'll be exploited by foreign multinationals. And then if there is agriculture, chances are it'll be monocrop for agro-export using Monsanto genetically produced seeds, and there's nothing to do with peasants. The indigenous people, the Colombians are a big unit group, and so on, they'll be gone. This is called the drug war. It's got nothing to do with drugs. The U.S. Army isn't doing it directly, but that's because we're in a neoliberal period. Things get privatized. So like atrocities now get privatized. The Colombian Army, for example, doesn't carry out the atrocities directly. It privatizes them to paramilitaries. If you look at the percentage of atrocities attributed by the State Department, forget anybody else. State Department reports the percentage of atrocities attributed to the military and the paramilitaries. It's remained about a steady 75 or 80%, but the relative proportions have changed. Now the Colombian Army carries out fewer atrocities and the paramilitary forces carry out more. But they're so closely intertwined that Human Rights Watch, which has done the major studies on it, simply describes the paramilitaries as the 6th division of the Colombian Army, has 5 official divisions, and has a 6th division, which is the privatized terrorists called paramilitaries. And the U.S. is privatizing its own atrocities. So instead of the U.S. the Army carrying out chemical warfare, it's now DynCorp and other so-called private companies, which consist of U.S. military officers and are funded by the U.S. government. So it's privatized chemical warfare, but it's still chemical warfare. And as I say, the pretext is a war on drugs. And even if it were a war on drugs, it would be just indescribably criminal. I mean, like if China, say, were to start fumigating Kentucky and North Carolina, where they produce really lethal substances that are killing way more people than all the hard drugs in the world, would we consider that fine? Yeah, I don't think so. In fact, that would lead to the nuclear war that somebody was talking about. But if we do it in Colombia, that's considered just fine, even if it were a war on drugs, which it isn't. It's not affecting the price of drugs. It's destroying peasant society. So yes, we're at war in Colombia, and it's a brutal war. Some of the worst atrocities of the 90s were in Colombia, had by far the worst human rights record in the hemisphere, and of course, typically had by far the highest U.S. military aid. That's a correlation that's very close. And it's continuing. Clinton's Plan Colombia extends it. And it's very likely going to go on, spreading around the region. Where it'll go, nobody knows, but you're right in thinking that that's, I'm sure the U.S. military is planning for that. Actually, the number of U.S. military around there is probably as high as it's ever been, and increasing.
September 11th, it was immediately predicted, and now we can look back and see that the prediction was correct, that every repressive force in the world would take it as a window of opportunity to extend what they were doing. So, for example, the Russians took it as an opportunity to extend the attack in Chechnya, pretending that it's a war on terror, and now with the authorization of Washington. The Chinese did the same in Western China. Indonesia did the same in Aceh, Israel and the occupied territories, and so on down the list. Furthermore, just about every government used it as an opportunity to try to impose greater discipline on their own populations. These are just continuations of tendencies that are already in process, using this kind of opportunity to escalate it. And that was predictable, and of course it's happened. September 11th just it opened a lot of people's eyes. I mean, the United States in particular is an extremely insular country. I mean, nobody knows anything about the outside world. The only thing anyone knows about Canada is that the health system is a shambles, and that the Social Security system doesn't work, and if anybody wants to get their a sprained ankle fixed, they have to come to the United States, and so on. That's the only thing anybody knows. And that's approximately what they know about any other country. So I happened to be in Sweden a couple of weeks ago giving talks, and the New York Times, I have to thank them for this, sent one of their chief correspondents to Sweden to write an article on Sweden.
which I could then use as an illustration of how the press works. So you can predict that the only article that will ever appear about Sweden is everybody commits suicide, or the system's breaking down, or something like that. And this article was about how nobody in Sweden works because they got this crazy welfare system. So people just say, I'm sick, and they don't go to work, and therefore the whole country is collapsing, and so on. I mean, that's approximately what people know about the outside world. And if you ask people where France is, probably half the population would put it in Africa. But September 11th did change that. I mean, it made lots of people recognize we better pay some attention to the world and to what the United States is doing in it. And it just opened a lot of minds. We should be careful when we use the phrase war on terrorism to remember that the term terrorism is used in a very narrow technical sense. It's referring to a very small part of terrorism, namely the terrorism that they carry out against us, but not the much worse terrorism that we carry out against them. So if you use the term, remember the special usage. But the so-called war on terror, there are people who want it to be a war against Muslims. I mean, I'm sure that's Osama bin Laden's fondest dream. If he could turn it into a war against Muslims, he'd have won. Then you get the Muslim world fighting the West, and it'll be a battle to the end of days. And I'm sure ultra-right Christian fundamentalists want the same thing. It's one of the reasons they support the extremist right in Israel. So yeah, there are people who would like that to turn out, but I'm sure that the guys planning it in Washington don't. I mean, that'd be the craziest thing for them to even think about. That's why they tossed North Korea into the axis of evil. Well, what's North Korea got to do with Iran and Iraq? I mean, I got more to do with them. But North Korea is not Muslim, so if you throw that in, it sort of makes it look as it's not a war. And it isn't. They're perfectly happy to deal with like the most populous Muslim state in the world, Indonesia, was a very close U.S. ally as long as it was being run by a guy who's identical to Saddam Hussein, who took power with a huge massacre, killing maybe 1 million people, greeted by complete euphoria in the United States and Canada and England, because he got rid of the main popular party of the poor peasants, and opened the place up to Western exploitation. And it didn't matter that it was Islamic. Okay, great. We run it. We get the resources. It's run by a murderous thug. What's the problem? The most reactionary, the most fundamentalist Arab state in the world, Saudi Arabia, has been a U.S. client ever since its founding. And you can run through the list. So there's no war against Islam. In fact, the U.S. is quite ecumenical. In the 1980s, the wars in Central America were largely fought against the Catholic Church. But it's not a war of civilization between the U.S. and Catholicism. It's just the Church had made a grievous error. They turned toward the preferential option for the poor. I mean, priests were organizing peasants and that kind of stuff. So you got to slaughter them. Just it wasn't Muslims. A biologist friend of mine who thinks that correctly that evolutionary psychology and sociobiology is a pile of junk, once gave an argument to prove that there was natural selection for stupidity and passivity. And the argument runs like this. He says, imagine a bunch of hunter-gatherers sitting around a fire, and somebody hears a saber-toothed tiger screaming outside. And most of them huddle around the fire, but one of them's kind of energetic and enthusiastic and smart and so on. So he figures he'll go out and drive the saber-toothed tiger away. Well, the chances of the other people's genes being perpetuated is fairly high, but the chances of his genes being perpetuated are rather low. So it's obvious that selection is going to lead to stupidity and passivity and so on. So it's just as good an argument as any other one, namely zero. But the fact is that answers your question, really. It's easier just to listen to something and sort of feel good and then go home and do something else. You want to try to go on and do something more, yeah, it takes effort and maybe a cost. And In the long term, it'll make a better world, but that's for everybody, not just for you.